I want to talk to you tonight about Fukushima, what happened there. There's been so much distortion and disinformation that I'd like to set the record straight. And I want to begin by talking about the Fukushima Daiichi reactor. Daiichi means number one. It's a complex. It's not a reactor itself. In Fukushima Daiichi, which is on the eastern coast of Tohoku, in the prefecture of Fukushima, there are 6 reactors all lined up in a line. You can see the square buildings there. That's only one of the assets of the Tokyo Electric Power Company, which is the largest public company in Japan. And, ladies and gentlemen, it's the largest electricity utility in the world. Not only do they have those 6 reactors, they have another Fukushima Daiichi, which is number 2 Fukushima, which is further north from there, and they have 4 reactors there. And then over on the Japan sea coast, they have Kashiwazaki Kariwa, another 7 reactors there. So that's a total of 17 reactors, 17 out of the fleet of 54 reactors in Japan. One has to wonder why the Japanese are so enthusiastic about nuclear power. After all, they got atom bombed twice. Well, I won't go into that much, except to say that President Dwight Eisenhower began a program after developing nuclear weapons in America to turn around and try and find some usefulness for nuclear energy, this terribly, awesomely destructive force. And he began a thing called Atoms for Peace in the early 1950s. And through a tremendously powerful and persuasive public relations exercise, managed to persuade the Japanese that you really need nuclear power. And he used quite a lot of characters there. Nakasone was a former prime minister. Nakasone, when he was a young man, was the principal proponent of nuclear power in Japan in the early 50s. The reason for it was that Japan has always felt that they lacked self-sufficiency in energy. And they wanted to get self-sufficiency. And the way the so-called nuclear village in Japan persuaded the people that nuclear energy was the way to go was that we don't have to import coal or gas or other energy sources. We can simply make nuclear energy with reactors and then close the fuel cycle by developing fast breeder reactors and reprocessing, and we don't have to bring in any more uranium. This hasn't worked, and in my own opinion, it won't work. It hasn't worked in other countries, and it won't work in Japan. Indeed, there isn't one functioning fast breeder reactor in the world today. There are a couple of prototype ones. There's one in India, there's one in Russia. France had 2, Phoenix and Super Phoenix. Japan had Monju and Joyo. Monju is a fast breeder reactor in which, unfortunately, they've had a series of accidents, and the last one was where a gantry about to put new enriched uranium fuel and plutonium mixed oxide fuel into the reactor, fell into the reactor, weighing tons, and they couldn't get it out. The thing was closed down, and the man in charge of the reactor committed suicide. So that's kind of the end of that story. What happened at Fukushima Daiichi is that we all know about the 11th of March last year. It was a cold, grey, overcast day in Japan, quite calm. But during the morning of that day, there were repeated earthquakes in northern Honshu, north of Tokyo. They were being felt in Tokyo too, as far as Osaka and Kobe and Yokohama as well. But the main ones were occurring off the coast, the eastern coast of Fukushima. They built up in force until around 2:30, one of the mothers of all earthquakes, a force 9 on the Richter scale, exploded in the subterranean plates about 300 kilometres off Fukushima to an extent that a seismic atmospheric monitoring station in Taiwan picked it up as a vibration in the ionosphere. It was so intense. The reactors seemed to withstand that series of earthquakes. They were jolted and shaken, but they seemed to be all right. until the tsunami, the tidal wave, came at around 2:30, 2:45. At this time, kids were coming out of their classrooms, little Japanese children in primary school wearing their neat uniforms and their mushroom hats, all lining up in lines to get in the buses or be picked up by their parents to go home, right across the prefecture. Wives, mothers were coming home with their shopping. Other people were beginning to round up their shifts at manufacturing plants. Farmers were beginning to put their stock in the sheds because it was still very cold, as I said. And suddenly this enormous tidal wave, in fact it was two tidal waves in conjunction, travelling at the speed of a jet aircraft, about 500 kilometres an hour, 600 kilometres an hour, came in, and as it came towards the shore, it's a very steep coast there. It goes down thousands of feet into what is called the Oshiro Current that comes down from Hokkaido. Very cold, full of fish, but a huge current. And this, as it came towards the shore, it built up energy. I swim at Bondi every morning, and you can see the waves there. You can tell when they're dumpers, when they're really coming in, they're going to damage you and chuck you on the sea, on the beach. And it came in and inundated the whole of the Sanriku coast, which is Iwate, Miyagi, and Fukushima prefectures, right up the coast of northern Honshu. And as you know, devastated enormous amounts of buildings. It killed 20,000 people. Trying to flee, they had some warning, but not enough. Some of the kids had already been picked up from school and were taken inland. There were some warnings by public telephone, and the Japanese have a very sophisticated mobile telephone system, and that was being used. So some escaped, but many, many, many did not. And the ones who weren't smashed up against buildings were carried inland, and then many of them washed out to sea. There's a piece of footage I've seen which hasn't appeared on the repeated series of television you've seen in Australia with the wave coming in, inundating all those plastic hothouses and sweeping fishing boats under bridges and smashing them up, all that stuff. But this is a very poignant shot, a long-distance shot of people labouring up a hill towards the camera. And there's a bloke in a wheelchair, and he's struggling, and little kids, and they're all just washed away and then taken away in the reflux of the water going out to sea. Shortly after all this, and you know the events, the sequence of events, the generators that had the emergency power were inundated with water. And just before that happened, the whole of the grid, the power grid in the Tohoku region went out. So suddenly, they had no electricity to drive the pumps, to keep the reactors cool, and the water inundated the emergency generators so they couldn't kick in. This is a bit what the reactor looks like. It's been said, not very truthfully, by the nuclear industry that this is a very old reactor. You know, we don't build them like this anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, that's nonsense. A third of the American fleet of 104 reactors are this design from General Electric. They're called boiling water reactors. They have one circuit of water that goes in through the reactor, out, flashes into steam through a steam generator, drives turbines, drives generators, develops electricity. This one, there are 6 of them at Fukushima Daiichi. Number 1 was built in 1970 by General Electric. 2, 3, 4 were built later on in the 70s by General Electric, Hitachi, Toshiba. Hitachi and Toshiba are 2 enormously powerful companies in Japan. And General Electric helped with that. So did the French company Ariba. They were involved in this too. And 5 and 6, the same thing. Now another myth is that there isn't much radiation coming out of these reactors. And anyway, look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 bombs dropped, and the radiation dispersed. Well, it did disperse much more quickly there because in Little Boy and Fat Man, the 2 enriched uranium and plutonium bombs dropped on those 2 cities, there are only about 15 to 20 kilograms of enriched uranium nuclear material in those bombs. Now, when they went off, that fissioned, and most people were killed by kinetic force and by heat. And not for some time did the Americans admit that there was also a thing called radiation sickness that was happening there too. People well after the blast who didn't have marks on them were getting sick and dying from losing their hair, the red platelets in their blood, coagulating, diminishing, getting sick in the stomach, having all sorts of illnesses. Some of them survived, many did not, they died. Not for some time did the authorities admit that there was such a thing. It was Wilfred Burchett, the Australian journalist, who's been much maligned in my view by Bob Menzies as a communist and a supporter of Stalin. There was none of those things. He was the first journalist to go to Hiroshima, and he went in there against the orders of General McCarthy, because all the journalists had to go on the battleship Missouri to witness the surrender by the Japanese to the American forces. But instead he jumped on the train and made his way to Hiroshima and recorded what was going on, the complete devastation in this atom bomb, and the way that people were, those who were still alive, were dying. The trouble is, to make the comparison though, Fukushima has, in one reactor, I'll move on to the next slide, just to show you that in one reactor, it's like a pear shape. This is the containment here, the reactor core, which contains about 70 tons of enriched uranium, enriched in the isotope 235 to 3%. And it's surrounded by a containment vessel which is made of steel. And underneath you've got the containment well, the wet well, the condensation chamber, where the water, after going through the reactor, is taken down into that condensation chamber, which is a great big donut around the whole building, turns back into water, and then is resurrected and brought back up into the cycle again, flashes into steam and keeps the generators turning. That is still basically what reactors are. The other kind of reactor is a pressurized water reactor, which actually has two circuits. One circuit goes through the reactor core and gets radioactive. The other one goes through a heat exchanger and takes the steam into turbines and generators, but it is not radioactive. So you can work on all that back end of the reactor without getting radiated. You often see great cooling towers. This is usually an iconic view of nuclear power, set with some sonorous overvoice from the announcer, with great big cooling towers with steam coming off the tops. Well, all that is a condensation chamber. It's got nothing to do with the reactor itself. And in fact, at Mall, in Victoria, the brown coalfields, you see those things all over the place. But that's what it looks like. Oh, I'll come to that later. So the reactors, what happened inside, 3 of them, 3 out of 6 of them, two were closed down. They're in cold shutdown, numbers 5 and 6. Number 4 was offline because it was just having a whole lot of irradiated fuel, spent fuel, put into its cooling pond, which is this thing up here. An extraordinarily vulnerable position. Why put a cooling pond which has so much irradiated fuel in it right up above the reactor? It seems very exposed. Well, the reason is because it's easy to use a gantry to take out the spent fuel rods from the outside of the core, take them up, across, and put them in the pool. It's a matter of utility. But the trouble is it's very exposed. And in reactor number 4, it was full of spent fuel, only just been put there, and it shook and actually created cracks in the vessel, which are still being assessed today, and it's very dangerous. But in 1, 2, and 3, the water fell, turned into steam. The steam and the enormous heat of 1200 degrees centigrade rising up to 2000 degrees centigrade was reacting with the zirconium in the cladding, in the rods, forming hydrogen and zirconium oxide. Now the hydrogen, as you know, is a very flammable gas, and in 3 of the reactors, 1, 2, and 3, it exploded and blew the tops off the reactors. There was pandemonium in the reactors because TEPCO had a safety culture propaganda, if you like, to suggest that these reactors were safe. To such an extent that they never talked about radiation to the Japanese people. They provided, as did all the other 9 utility companies in Japan with reactors, they provided money for jobs, tax relief, kindergartens, schools, roads, hospitals. It was a form of institutionalised bribery to get the people in the regions where reactors were going to be built used to having reactors. And they're safe. There were, you know, the Japanese love comic strips and comic books, manga. There was a very tragic manga that was created, that was drawn up, the Fukushima explosions, for little kids of between 2 and about 6. And it showed Mr. Reactor. He had a bad tummy ache. And that was all right, provided he only farted. That's what the Japanese, pretty basic language. But if you did a poo, you were in trouble and you had to get under your desk. It's that kind of propaganda that the Japanese were using to try and convince kids that it was all right. The reactors blew huge clouds of radiation that first, fortunately, went out to sea. But when the wind swung around, 11th, 12th, 13th of March, they came back to the northwest. And a huge cloud of radiation containing iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, plutonium-235, 239, and many other actinides and radioactive toxins and poisons were blowing across northeastern Honshu. There was a huge storm, a rainstorm, around the 14th or 15th of March, which pushed all that radiation down onto the tops of the mountains. And when my wife and I went there in October to go up to the region, we were warned not to ever, not now, not ever, could you go bushwalking in those lovely mountains in Fukushima that led down to the sea, because they were radioactive. But they weren't the only things that were radioactive. Rice fields were just about to, let's see, that's right, we're coming into summer, so there's spring planting, they've been planted. Rice was there. A lot of livestock in the region too, in Fukushima and Iwate and Miyagi. This is one of the tragedies of what happened was that this is one of the richest agricultural areas in Japan. We talk about Kobe beef and how beautiful that is. It comes from Kobe, from southwest of Honshu. But the beef from Fukushima is much better, so the locals claim. It's beautifully bred. Every beef cow has a certificate of authenticity. There are goats, there are sheep, there's a lot of cats and dogs, of course, and there's some pets. These all have to be left behind when the government reluctantly decided, against the advice of TEPCO, which was obfuscating the whole issue, that people within a 10-kilometre radius had to leave. And then they upped that to a 20-kilometre radius. Every day appeared in the daily in the press in Tokyo this map showing the concentric circles of where the reactors are and what the so-called radiation levels are in these regions. You notice it goes down to Tokyo. Here's Tokyo there. And they're talking about millisieverts. Now, millisievert is a measurement of radiation of what is permitted in the human body, according to the authorities. And it's measured in terms of a standard man of about 70 kilograms and about 5 feet 8 or 9 inches tall. In Australia, I think they'd be a bit bigger than that. But that's supposed to be, and 20 millisieverts a year is the maximum dosage that man can have and not get some kind of radiation cancer. The trouble is, kids of, 3 to 5 kilograms are having the same criterion applied to them. What the dickens is this all about? Not only that, but the Japanese government was now in panic mode, and it was upping the level. And these maps, which appeared every day, they always have a footnote saying, this is well below the radiation level that you need to worry about. Ignoring what is now, I think, an established fact in science, in radiation science, that there is no minimum dose of radiation. It's a bit like smoking. Some smokers never get lung cancer. Other smokers do, and some people who never smoke get lung cancer. Radiation, you might be hit by cesium-137, iodine, whatever. You might never get sick from cancer from that radiation. But the chances that you will increase. It depends on your psychology. It depends on your genetic structure. It depends on your physical health and your susceptibility to cancer. What we suspect in the nuclear skeptical industry, as I'm part of, what we suspect is that the nuclear industry has been able to disingenuously say that there have been no fatalities from radiation at Fukushima, therefore it's safe. Just as there were no fatalities at 3 Mile Island in 1979, there were no fatalities at Calder Hall in Britain in 1956. They tend to avoid Kishtyn, which is near Chelyabinsk in the Soviet Union, probably the worst nuclear accident, worse than Chernobyl, worse than Fukushima, where the Japanese had the Russians, the Soviet Union had a bomb factory and were producing weapons from plutonium-239, and they had the plutonium trenches in this, it's really a slave labour town with all these indentured people brought in by Stalin to make nuclear weapons. It was the height of the Cold War in the 50s. And there's an explosion, not a nuclear explosion, but a lot of the plutonium blew up, and many, many, many thousands of people died. And it didn't come out immediately because of the Soviet Union putting a clamp on the whole thing. But in fact it happened, and only later have people realised what an enormous catastrophe that was. Not just in the number of people who died, but in the long-term genetic effects of that as well. With Chernobyl, there's still an enormous amount of controversy about how many people died. The estimates go from one optimistic figure of about 8,000 deaths. I think that was put together by the World Health Organization and the International Atomic Energy Agency, up to 1 million. That was put together by Russian scientists, and it only came out about 2 years ago. But meanwhile, we continue to have this argument about radiation, and we have heterodox views. A colleague of mine at the University of the Australian National University, the Professor of Nuclear Physics, Aidan Byrne, a very polite New Zealander, knows a lot about nuclear physics, but is not a physician. But he claims that radiation really doesn't do you much damage at all. I must quote, I don't know if he's in the audience, but Professor Barry Brook. No answer? Okay.
Professor Barry Brook.
Not here, but what he said after the Fukushima accident was, the risk of meltdown is extremely small, and the death toll from any such accident, even if it occurred, will be zero. There will be no breach of containment and no release of radioactivity beyond, at the very most, some venting of mildly radioactive steam to relieve pressure. Those spreading fear, uncertainty and doubt at the moment will be the ones left with egg on their faces. I am happy to be quoted forever after on the above if I am wrong, but I won't be. The only reactor that has a small probability of being finished is unit number 1, and I doubt that, but it may be offline for a year or two. Not only did he say this straight out to the reactor, but quite a lot, he repeated the same kind of message for some time afterwards. I'll come back to the Australian attitude because it's very interesting. You people in South Australia, you've got Honeymoon and Olympic Dam and Beverley, 3 mines, and the word is that South Australia has the biggest and richest uranium deposits in the world. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but never mind. But there are a lot of miners who were very angry indeed, when Fukushima occurred, and I've been to a number of seminars at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, which is very pro-nuclear, that were fulminating about the myths that are created about nuclear power and how bad it is. And, you know, you have to think, well, what is all this about? Well, it's about money, it's about shares, it's about power. And it will continue until, and I think it's happening in Japan, people realise that this is one hell of a way to boil water, and it's very dangerous, and there are much better ways of generating electricity. Let me just to continue to say that, and I'll not take too much longer, but why do I think that things are changing in Japan? Well, the Japanese, they're very good at bearing misfortune. They're very stoic people, very disciplined people. And I generalise, of course, but if you can generalise about anyone, you can generalise about the Japanese. I've got many friends there. I speak the language. I live there. My wife speaks much better than I do. Mine is very stilted Japanese, but nevertheless, it's a wonderful country and they're wonderful people, very inventive. But there's a nuclear village. And the nuclear village consists of bureaucrats in the government, nuclear bureaucrats in the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, who are very pro-nuclear. The big companies like Toshiba, Hitachi, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, Ishikawa, Jima, Harima, and others who make the things. They make the containment vessels, they make the nuclear rods, they process things, they enrich things, they do the whole process. It's a huge industry, multi-billion-dollar industry. And a lot of local officials and government officials who think that this is the way to self-reliance. Japan is going to be great again. You know, the analogy is with the Second World War. The Kwangtung Army decided in the 30s that we had to go south and invade China and invade Southeast Asia and take all the rubber plantations from those wicked white colonialists and the oil and the food products and the palm oil and everything, so that we would become a self-sustaining empire, the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. And then the only thing that stopped them with that was when the Emperor said, with massive understatement, that the war was not necessarily going to our advantage after Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been bombed, so they changed course. And then they changed course radically to a policy of economic expansion and growth, as you know, and became very successful in the 50s and the 60s, and the nuclear industry was part of that. And that's where the vision developed in the minds of the nuclear village. We can develop this power and it will sustain us. We will be world leaders. And there are 54 reactors in Japan to prove that case. They've had a few accidents in the past, but nothing compared with Fukushima. And now this has occurred, there are people who are beginning to say it's not on. There are Nobel Prize laureates like Kenzaburo Oe and other writers, philosophers, creative people, and politicians who are saying we don't want nuclear power anymore. You know that in 2009, the Democratic Party of Japan, for the first time since the end of the war, apart from a very brief period, became the first liberal, with a small L, semi-socialist government in Japan. And they're taking over from the conservative Liberal Democratic Party, the Jiminto. And they said, Hatoyama, the first Prime Minister under the new regime, said, we're going to stop the power of the bureaucrats, we're going to take over, we the elected people in the Diet are going to run this country, and we're not going to let the Conservatives run things. But then he fell on his sword and Naoto Kan took over, and Kan was the Prime Minister when Fukushima blew, and he was not all that experienced. He was a bright man, but he was anti-nuclear. And he was particularly panicked by a report that he got from his Prime Ministerial Office technicians who said, look, if this reactor cooling pond in reactor number 4 actually falls over, or if the reactor vessels themselves breach, you're going to have to evacuate Tokyo, 250 kilometres to the south. And he knew you couldn't do that. You can't evacuate 15 to 20 million people from a city quickly like that. Couldn't be done. And I think probably wisely in retrospect, he held that to himself. He didn't let that out, but it deeply worried him. Because if he'd let it out, it would have panicked everyone. Didn't happen. And, you know, it proved to be not the case. Tokyo is still surviving, and it's okay so far. What he did do, though, was close the Hamaoka plant, which is southwest of Tokyo, which is much closer to Tokyo and just as susceptible to earthquakes and tsunamis as Fukushima. He also insisted on taking away the nuclear regulatory body from METI, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. There's a system in Japan called amakudari, which means descent from heaven, or descent from the gods. The gods are the bureaucrats. And they had a cozy arrangement with the private companies, Mitsubishi et al., that once they retired, they would take over senior positions in these companies, you see. So that each was scratching the other's back. They weren't regulating at all, independently. They were part of the industry. So what Naoto Kan did was say, you know, I'm not going to have this anymore. He also started a push for renewables. But the pressure became too great, and he also fell on his sword only about 6 months ago and passed over the command to Prime Minister Yoshihiko Noda. Now, Noda is a different kettle of fish. He's the present Prime Minister. He doesn't say much. He's an economist. Naoto Kan was an engineer. And Noda doesn't have the same fire in his belly about changing the political situation in Japan to get rid of nuclear power. And meanwhile, the nuclear village is regathering their forces. They've got big, powerful men in METI who are now pushing nuclear power again, saying, really, it's safe, you don't have to worry, that was an aberration, it won't happen again. But you've got a whole lot of local governments, prefectural governments. The government of Fukushima was the first one to do it, to say, hey, we don't want reactors anymore. And the law in Japan says that you must have local government approval before you can restart any of those reactors. And right now, only 3 out of 54 reactors in Japan are operating. And last summer, 11 were. And the Japanese got through that hot summer without blackouts and without having to cut off their air conditioners except for sometimes, aided by a remarkable self-discipline among the people who were only too prepared to accommodate the government's wish to conserve power, and they did lots of things to do that. So you're building up a head of steam here, and I say in my book, if any of you care to read it when it comes out, and yes, I would like your suggestions on the title for it. I'm saying in that I think the Japanese have turned a corner, and I think that there's going to be a change. Now, Alison and I went up to the region in the Shinkansen fast train, and we went to Fukushima, and we went to Minamisoma, and we talked to farmers, and we talked to local officials, and many of them were very frank with us. And we also went to a hospital, a medical hospital, the Fukushima Medical Centre, and met a very charming young professor of radiation medicine in his clinic. And his clinic was very modern. It had every bit of equipment. It had a stainless steel bath to wash radiation off victims, and it had a gurney at the front with a dummy on it and showing how you bandage it up so that it'll be all right. And you had charts on the wall. But what struck a note in me was the charts were all about naturally occurring radiation. That is radiation you get from granite or from the sun. And he said at the end, I said, look, you don't seem to be worried. Are you staying here with your young children? He said, yes. He said, I'm here to disprove the lie. I'm here to say that radiation is all right and it's going to be okay. And as my wife and I left, we thought, I wonder if TEPCO financed this clinic. I wonder if they paid this man's salary. I wonder if they've financed the whole hospital. I've got to be careful in my book not to make that assumption into a fact because I don't know. But I suspect that's the case. But there are some captains of industry coming on board about this new thing of renewables. They haven't done much yet. And some conservatives we talked to in Tokyo said, you can't do it, we don't have enough wind, we don't have enough solar, we don't have enough geothermal, but they do. There's a tremendous amount of geothermal in Japan. It's the worst possible archipelago on which to build nuclear reactors because it's so prone to earthquakes. But also they've got enormous geothermal capacity. Masayoshi Son is the Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Japanese computer giant SoftBank. He's one of the richest men in Japan. And he said, for us to head towards a clean and more inexpensive option over the long term, all the government needs to do is to take solar power purchasing policy it is already discussing one step further and simply add the resolution to purchase all power at 40 yen for the next 20 years. It is sheer nonsense to cling to nuclear power when it will recede in the future, instead of taking a path that will definitely lead to cost reduction. Solar, solar thermal, wind, geothermal, biomass, oceanic energy and other blessings of nature can be used for thousands of years without contaminating the earth. These are forms of energy that coexist with nature without destroying it. Ports of the past can gain new life as ports of solar and wind energy. Such recovery projects would create huge job opportunities for the region's people, and Japanese manufacturers already have the #1 solar technology in the world. Instead of exporting it, we should use it domestically to create the world's largest solar belt. There are a lot of other visionaries who are saying, let's build photovoltaics and other kinds of renewable energy along the tall Hawke coast. And my bet, ladies and gentlemen, and I say this in my book, sticking the neck out of course, is that the nuclear industry in Japan has a short life from now on. I give it 10 years before there's a diminution. A lot of reactors are not going to go back online. None are going to be built. No new ones are going to be built. And the ones that will be allowed to come back online will be done grudgingly and simply as part of a mix to get over the interregnum until they go to renewables. And let me finish by saying what impression I think this will have on the rest of the world. Japan, as you know, is a world leader in all sorts of technologies. The Koreans are catching up fast. Korea is very gung-ho about nuclear and will continue. They're having a nuclear safety conference in March in Seoul this year, in which the whole task is to prove that nuclear is safe. No one's going to ask the question, should we have it at all? But they're going to reinforce the message that it is safe, and they've got lots and lots of people. It follows on from the Obama conference of 2009 in Washington, where they were talking about nuclear safety, but the emphasis there was on terrorism. This is on safety. Russia will continue to develop Rosatom and its nuclear external capacities. The British, they're still pro-nuclear. God knows why, because their technology is not very good. The Americans are equivocal. You'll notice that Obama has just signed off on 2 new reactors being built somewhere in the United States, but there are 104 of their fleet, and many of them are aging and will have to close down. They still, and this is one of the biggest problems with nuclear, no one has yet developed a spent fuel repository that can take that stuff and isolate it from the biosphere for the required geological time. Yucca Mountain is a joke. It's a political football. It's not working. The Swedish have tried. The French think they've got somewhere. And the French too. The French, as you know, are very positive about second or third biggest nuclear power. 58 reactors. Sarkozy is in favour of them, but Ségolène Royal and the new leader of the Socialist Party, the Social Party who is standing for the next presidential election, is against nuclear power. Very interesting to see what happens there. The Germans have stopped. Now, 2 countries, Germany with its powerful economy and Japan with its powerful economy, can prove anything at all. It will be that we can do without nuclear. So it doesn't leave the miners, BHP Billiton, and the American owners of Beverly and the people who own Honeymoon very far to go. And I'm very sorry for South Australia. We've got a premier who wants this and sees dollar signs flashing in his eyes. But the fact is that uranium exports from Australia are just over $1 billion a year. Queensland alone exports $400 billion of coal a year. It's a drop in the bucket. I think it's less than the value of industrial salt that we export from this country. And yet we blow it up into a big thing. Final point to make is, if I could end on this note, Julie Bishop is fond of saying when she was Shadow Minister for the Environment that, you know, we need nuclear because it's going to save us from global warming. is the fact electricity generation around the world accounts for 18% of carbon emissions. 18%. So even if tomorrow, through some miracle, you could change all the coal and oil and gas generators into nuclear, you're still not making much of a dent on the other two major villains, which are transport, hydrocarbons, and the deforestation. They're the things that are doing the damage, not nuclear. So thank you very much for your indulgence, and I'd like to answer questions and have a discussion if you'd like.